Hello.
Stradtman. We're doing the Handmaid to Heroine podcast, introducing Liz Dente. Liz, thank you for being on today.
Thank you for asking me to be on. This is great.
Can you give me a little bit of your background, please? Like what was your soul-sucking authoritarian structure?
Sure. I'm glad that you put it that way, because I've struggled to identify my background as a cultish background, just from a traditional sense of what a cult is. But I think that ultimately I've come to that conclusion, but the authoritarian thread has always been there. The church background I come from is, I guess they would call it non-denominational. The church itself was a covenant church, which kind of just follows a lot of, it pulls from a bunch of different things. Assemblies of God was a big influence, and we had a lot of partner churches in that vein. But yeah, grew up in church, was born into it. My parents started kind of believing, following in their 20s and 30s. And so it was something that was very heavily influenced throughout my childhood, and then focus on the family, James Dobson, kind of all of those very kind of leaning fundamentalist influences were there. I was actually homeschooled, so I did a Becca curriculum, Saxon math, like kind of all those Christian influenced homeschool curriculums. So didn't have a lot of external influence in that sense. I very much lived in a bubble. And went through it all. My mom was a pro-life, fundraising, volunteering woman. I ended up going to a Christian college for a while, and it was in college that I kind of had my breaking point, I would say. That's a long story too, but I eventually identified myself as bisexual. I was 27 at the time. I had gone as a little bit of an older student, and just all the things that I'd been wrestling with and thinking through and feeling, and recognizing as my own true feelings kind of came to a head, and couldn't deny that anymore. Very much followed by kind of an emotional shutdown, I would call it, for several months as I processed that. And, I hit a wall for sure. But it's been a slow process of coming out of that for probably the last, I guess it's been 8 years now or so, and kind of figuring out what my values are and piecing things back together. So that's where we are now.
Wow. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a few more questions.
Sure. I'm sure you do. I have questions too. I have lots of questions.
Fair point. So
there's a running list for my pastor growing up.
Ooh.
I have questions, yes. But please go ahead.
Well, now I'm thoroughly intrigued. Okay, yeah. What would one of those questions be?
Let's go with yours first. And I think some of them might come up in the course of this conversation.
Perfect. So first, I just want a statement of intention for our little sacred space here. Sure. If we could wave a magic wand and you could have exactly the outcome, the experience that you want from this today, what would it be?
I think that there's a lot of intentions, but I think the biggest one is just adding my voice to the conversation. I think that there's a very unique time that we're all experiencing kind of in American history, or I mean, it's not history yet, but it's happening fast. It will be history soon. And, I think there's a lot of pieces of what's going on now that have caught a lot of people off guard. But for someone like me, and it seems like someone like you who grew up kind of in these very high control groups, especially coming from spiritual backgrounds that used a lot of the Christian mythology, Christian story, Christian influence, it's not a surprise at all. I think, my parents have been saying the things that we're hearing out of a lot of our politicians' mouths and the people who are driving a lot of this discourse for 30 years. I'm not surprised to hear it. I've debated my parents for years on this stuff. And so it's interesting now that those of us who grew up in these scenarios kind of have a little bit of insight to offer as to how people think and why they think this way, and whether they can be brought back from thinking this way. Is there hope for assimilating them back into our lives in a way that we can all move forward together? I don't have answers on all of that, but I do think that I have a voice about where it's coming from at the very least, and can sort of share my story, and hopefully that helps other people feel not so isolated, because the isolation, I think, is the big tool and the big controlling tactic.
You have
So that's
said
my
a lot.
intention. Yeah, that's my intention, to add my voice to the conversation.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So you said something that I can't let go of.
Okay.
Well, it was all of it I find very meaningful, but things you heard your parents say years ago that are now in the general milieu, as it were. What are some of those things that you're hearing going, oh?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them came up, starting around, I think, 2015, 2016, when people started to feel a bit more emboldened to sort of share what they were maybe thinking and maybe didn't say out loud before. But again, a lot of these things were being said behind closed doors before that. Most of it is stuff that, you hear kind of in the news now that becomes a shocking headline. Things like, women don't deserve the right to have a decision about their own bodies, things about abortion. My mom volunteered, and I think still volunteers actually, at a pro-life clinic, which, it's one of those places that you Google it to maybe find services, and they'll come up right alongside it. And it doesn't really disclose that they're coming from, the mindset of trying to persuade people with uteruses having children to have those babies. But she's done that for a very, very long time. When I was 5 years old, I went door to door in our neighborhood, knocked on doors, solicited donations for our, Walk for Life is what we called it. And to me, that was just what we did. And I never thought of it as something that infringed upon my rights or my autonomy as a self-identifying, female, somebody with a womb, a uterus, the ability to have children. I never thought of that as something that was contradictory to my ability to make choices, because it just was. And so that's one major theme that existed for me growing up. But to me, that's not surprising now that they've been pushing for that, influence in the Supreme Court, et cetera, because all along that's what they want. They've been saying that they want it. And I think that it's just such a, as I've come from that bubble, just sort of out into the world at large, you start to see how extreme that rhetoric is, how specific that rhetoric is, how much they believe it, and how much they're willing to sort of put their all of their energy behind it. They breathe that. My mom breathes that. It's her life. She I truly believe that she would sacrifice herself, and she has given her time for that belief. And so, you come out into the world and people are shocked to hear it, but at the same time, I don't always see people matching that kind of energy, and people just want to be able to live their lives. They have the right to do that. But there's an intensity in the way that people in these groups think, and the way that they live their lives, the things that they believe, discipline of their children, how they give their money, whether or not we, allow for sex or certain types of relationships, again, all these things that feel very shocking now to be just sort of out in the world, and realize that this is just people living their lives. But in that bubble, they felt almost natural in a way to think in that extreme way, because it's all you knew. And it was framed as a spiritual, end all be all, this is for people's souls kind of battle. And so you thought of yourself in a short term, I'm a warrior, this is kind of what I'm here for sort of mentality. And everything was just so heightened, because everything was life or death in a very literal sense, according to this belief system. So I've said a lot, but yeah, that's kind of the framework that I'm coming from. So when I now see it seeping into the mainstream, to me, that's not surprising.
I'll bet not.
Yeah.
What's another example of things that were said behind closed doors back in the day that now it's like people just
so anybody who feels attraction toward same sex or some, that sort of thing, the word abomination was used.
Oh, that's a word. Whoa.
And that was that was used to teach children. That was used in Sunday school. That lifestyle is an abomination, is what was taught. And so again, you're just children. You're looking up to your parents. You're absorbing the things that are being taught to you. You want to do good, and you want to please, and you want to learn the right lesson so that you believe the right thing. And so those types of things become ingrained so deeply from such a young age because you're not questioning them at that time. That's one thing. Another thing would be tithing. I mean, we gave 10% of our money to the church without question. And we were constantly struggling with money as a result of that because it was such a huge portion of what came in. But that wasn't a negotiable line item on the budget. So that was kind of a given. So you wonder, where do these groups get their money from? People donate, and they fully believe that they're donating to something that is beyond themselves. It's a bigger cause. Again, it's life and death. There's kind of that idea that they're contributing to something eternal. So there's that motivation for them. And that seeped into the really mundane too. Like even things like prayer, like we constantly had to pray about things like if we're going to go see a movie or not, we had to pray on whether God put it on our heart to choose this one or that one, if it's the right message or not. Just the control and the idea that you didn't have the right to make your own choices or to feel your own feelings and make choices out of that sense of what is right and wrong. There was none of that was really developed or existed.
My feeling on it is, my experience of it is, and observations that it is supposed to be externally derived instead of intrinsics. Like, what do I feel like doing? What feels good to me? That's never a question.
Yes.
It's always
never a question.
Yeah.
And there, I mean, I think that is something that I want to, even more than like a skill, that's a biological thing, I think, that gets developed over time. You get reinforced signals from your brain, your body learns, cues and what feels good, what doesn't. And if you don't learn that when you're developing, it's a very deliberate process to try to reattach those connections later on in life and to reinforce them so that you remember what it is that you want or feel or like or enjoy or don't like. That's a process to try to do that consciously after the fact.
Yes.
It's a worthwhile process, but it's definitely an interesting thing to do afterwards.
Very much so. Tapping into your own intrinsic, embodied experience of the world. And yeah, it's huge. By the way, I forgot to ask, got to ask if I touch on any topics, like what's your safe word?
Oh my goodness. I just realized that we didn't pick one.
Yeah.
Let's go with giraffe.
Giraffe. Okay.
that one, it's the one that came to mind, and I think it. Hopefully, that doesn't come up in any stories. I don't think so.
Okay, so that's your safe word. So if at any point in time you don't want to answer, giraffe. And okay. So you're brought up into this, so it's not like you got sucked in. You were born into it. You're indoctrinated. Along the way, you obviously had, well, I'm going to ask you about the naughty 9 first before we do that. So the naughty 9,
let's do it.
9 topics that I would love to know how they were discussed at church and like what the church was saying about these things. First topic, sex. What were they saying?
God, that's a big one. Sex. Well, first of all, I don't ever recall having a talk in the way that, you sort of discuss having them with your parents. It was kind of just avoided. I'm the oldest child, by the way. So a lot of the things that I think I experienced maybe were figured out a bit more with my siblings after, possibly. I'm not sure, but just I'm speaking from my experience as the oldest, who was the test child, the test child. So I never had the talk. Church discussed sex as we talked about Song of Solomon a lot, weirdly enough. That was something that, because it was biblical, I remember having a sermon series on it. But I think I was older at the time. A sermon series, like they actually did like a book study on Song of Solomon.
On Song of Solomon. Okay, so it's okay. So women need to put out regularly.
Yes. It's within the context of the husband, the wife, the sort of traditional, idea of Christian, what's the word I'm looking for? Nuclear family. It is definitely part of it's supposed to only happen within the context of marriage, heterosexual marriage. I had a purity ring. We did the whole pledge thing to not have sex before marriage, abstinence. And abstinence included talking about it, really. So it just wasn't discussed much in the household. It was sort of you'll figure out what you need to figure out when it's appropriate to figure it out. I wasn't allowed to date until I was 16, but by the time I was 16, I was so stunted. I think that I was too scared at that time. Right. And most of the people I knew anyway were people from the same kind of circles. So we all kind of had the same fears and apprehension and things like that. Later on, I was a youth leader we partnered with an Assemblies of God church and we merged our youth groups. So we had some other influences of the youth pastors and things coming in there. And not huge differences, I think, in theology, but we were a little bit more open to teaching about, but again, it was always in the godly context of abstinence is preferable, prepare you.
We're back. Hey!
Sorry about that.
I think all that sex talk fried the airwaves. It's such,
It was too hot to handle. Let me get the camera set up real quick. I'll make sure that we're good here.
I mean, purity rings, that's some hot stuff.
Tell me what the last thing was that you heard.
The last thing that I heard was around how the two churches merging together and that whole Song of Solomon series.
Yes.
And yes, and about how the views were pretty much pretty harmonious with you all in the Assemblies of God, but then there were some profound differences, or not?
I don't know if there were profound differences. I think so. What I remember mainly was that there was a little bit more openness to discussing it, or at least acknowledging that it was kind of a facet of human existence. But it was still within the same context of, marriage is blessed by God, and it's the kind of thing that should only be sex should only be undertaken within that context, because that's the only context that God blesses it. And everything else is, not permissible, essentially, or that you're, sinning. Masturbation was not allowed.
Okay, I wondered, yeah.
At least it was. Again, there was a lot of things that weren't discussed. So when they were, it was either insinuated or there was kind of a discussion of kind of your heart, your mindset, whether or not you were doing things within God's best plan, I think was kind of how things were described often, but they just weren't talked about very often. And so there was it was more of the culture of shame around it that created ambiguity that I think allowed for people to kind of arrive at their own conclusions of like, let's err on the side of safety and not participate, or at least like assume that that's kind of what was intended. It wasn't so much like a fire and brimstone sort of thing. It was more of the shame culture around it to the point. And like, a good example of that is that like if we were watching a movie and there was a sex scene on, my dad would leave the room if there was something romantic on the screen. And that's affected me, like, even to this day. Like, I was watching the most recent episode of House of the Dragon, and, there's Game of Thrones, like, there's sex in it and everything.
Oh, yeah.
And I still catch myself with these little moments of discomfort where I, like, sort of very quickly almost, like, avert my eyes or feel like it's a private thing or something I shouldn't be seeing. And like, I have to consciously just be like, you're fine. it's okay. It's part of the story. And
fact of life.
What's that?
It's a fact of life. People have sex.
Fact of life. It's the only way that life comes to exist. Like it is the beginning of life in that sense. But there's it's funny because there's so many things that still catch me by surprise with like how deep they went, that I have to, no pun intended, that I have to kind of tease them apart and just realize what I believe versus what I was taught, and to not just act out of that sort of programming to feel or think or act a certain way.
Thank you. The next on the naughty nine. Money. What'd they say about money?
Money, like I mentioned, we tithe 10%, so that was God's first. Money, what's funny is that we didn't talk a lot about it other than that. I think it was mostly supposed to be a tool. There was definitely stewardship involved. So like using resources wisely was always a conversation. But I think for me, we didn't talk about it a lot in church that I recall, because it was a big topic in my family, but it was more of a big topic because it was kind of a struggle for my parents. Like they didn't come from families that had a lot of financial literacy. And so there was very much a
figuring things out. But what the big influence was that it was something that between my parents, it was seen more as my dad's responsibility to manage.
Of course.
So there wasn't a lot of participation on my mom's side. And so he made some interesting choices throughout the years, and that, got us into, we talked about debt a lot because that's just the situation that my dad was in.
Yeah.
And to the point where we didn't do family vacations. We
Right.
didn't really have, going to get an ice cream on a summer night was like a big decision because we were spending money. And he had a decent income. He had a good job working for the army, like he's a mechanical engineer working for the army. And so to me, it just felt, that discrepancy, I think, was the thing that I took away, was that I didn't have a good understanding of where it was coming from and then how to sort of like properly allocate it. But that was more of a life skill, I think, than related to the faith thing that we had going on. But I think the big faith influences were that, one, my mom wasn't involved and she didn't really think it was her place to get involved. So that led to issues down the line. And then two, the tithing put us in a tight spot because he gave so much kind of blindly to the church when we really could have used it ourselves.
Right. So like for feeding kids and buying shoes and stuff.
Oh, yes. And we donated to, I think, World Vision. We were sponsoring kids all over the world, things like that. Charitable giving is huge.
That's what I was going to ask next. It's like, okay, you did the ties thing. I'm betting there were offerings in the picture.
There were. Okay. Compassion International, we all sponsored children. World Vision, we sponsored children. I don't know if I should say that specifically, but those organizations that I think they did some good work, but whether or not we should have been sponsoring, it's hard to know. Where does your money go? I don't know. They send us a picture of a child in a letter once a month. It's like, is that really what's happening? Who knows? It's not the full story. So
no, it's not. Unfortunately, but your parents gave with a full heart, feeling and thinking and believing that the money was actually going to help somebody somewhere else.
That was the hope. Yes, that was the hope.
Okay, so those are the messages. What was said about the arts, about entertainment, about those industries?
It depended on the kind of art. So music, we weren't really allowed to listen to if it was, we call it secular. What's funny is that I don't hear that word at all after being outside of the church. I thought that was such a common thing, like the things were secular or Christian. And I've literally never heard that word since I've left the church. So I don't even know if that's one of those like Christianese words that people don't really know what it means. You know what I'm saying? Because
I do.
It's it had such powerful meaning in that context, but like outside of it, so we weren't allowed to listen to music that wasn't secular, or that wasn't Christian. I'm sorry, that was secular.
That wasn't sacred.
It wasn't sacred. Well, yeah, and so like there were a lot of Christian groups. I think we grew up in an interesting time when there was a lot of Christian music, the music festivals like Creation Fest, like out in Pennsylvania. So the funny thing about art is that there was always, this is a complicated conversation for me. I did this painting behind me, by the way. Grew up, I think, with a bend towards creativity and expressing myself creatively. But the thing about Christian art is that it's often an imitation of secular art, and it's often co-opted or sanitized in a way that makes it palatable for Christians. But the energy and the work that's done to get to create that initial product and the time that it takes to develop something from a creative place often wasn't truly done on the Christian side of things. It was sort of on the shoulders of, you know what I'm saying?
I do.
And I grew very frustrated with that because I often wanted to kind of be in creative realms. I think if I could do it over or like go talk to younger me, I think I would have enjoyed being in the film industry. I would have liked to kind of tell those stories. I'm a technically minded person. I would have liked to be on a set and kind of, work in those types of environments. But I didn't realize that until so much later in life that now it's not really financially feasible to go be like a PA. But again, movies, if there was sex involved, we weren't supposed to, there was always like have you ever heard of Plugged In magazine?
It rings a bell.
It was one of the Focus on the Family publications, and it was specifically sent out, I think it was weekly, to review any media. So it was movies, it was music, it was television shows. So all of our
keep it pure.
to keep it pure. Yeah, and it was rated and ranked and dissected, and there were mentions of whether sex was involved or whether God was involved or if there was a moral message. So like everything had to exist for morality, for like the message of Christianity. And if it didn't fall into that category, there were no redeeming qualities, and so therefore it wasn't worth your time. And so art to me was always like, that could be any of those sort of like entertainment media things, not so much like, static painted works of art, but even that was sanitized. We only had things with Bible verses on them, or Thomas Kincaid, or
oh my gosh, Thomas Kincaid. That man made a fortune.
It didn't exist to like elicit emotion. It existed to comfort you and kind of lull you into like just feeling like nothing. Like there wasn't a whole lot of anything behind it.
You have said so much.
So frustrating, because I knew that was wrong or off, or just not wrong. That's the wrong word. I just knew that there was something missing from it. The soul was not there. And I was, right.
It's soul sucking.
Encouraged. I was, it's soul sucking.
It is soul sucking. It's vitality sucking. There's no life force in it.
100%. Because it's like, if everything that you encounter, like I'm a big believer that like design affects you, right? Like the things around you, if a room is well designed, color matters, like things like that to me are very, very important. And like even the layout of a room, is going to affect your mood one way or another. So to me, when you're surrounded by art that either it only serves to glorify God because it has lyrics or whatever that kind of, amplify him, bring your attention to him, it's kind of worship music in disguise, whatever it needs to be, or it's just numbing, as in there's nothing being elicited from you, recognized in you, challenging to you in that experience, then it kind of funnels you towards this one existence, this one plane of thought, that the only thing that matters is God. And so my experience being surrounded by, things that I hate to even use the word art. I'm struggling to say art because it's not to me what it was.
Right.
But media, renderings, songs, all of it. Yeah. It was like technically proficient, but it just lacked a message. And ironically enough, I went to different colleges with a portfolio for review because I wanted to go to an art school. And that is what I was told when they did my art portfolio reviews was, you're very technically proficient, but we don't see the creativity or your voice. And I was like 16 or 17 when this happened. And I went with my dad and he took me and he had no idea what to say to me. He didn't know how to like console me. I don't think he fully even understood how devastated I was about that, because I felt like I was putting my heart and soul into these things and liked the process of making them, but they were right. I wasn't saying anything. There was no me in it. So I have recognized from a very young age, and I think, and it's very deliberate in a church setting, I think that art is lacking because they don't want it to reflect you. They don't want you to be present in that. They don't want your individuality to overshadow God in the art, in whatever it is that you're producing. So I have a very complicated relationship with that, and still a lot of resentment, to be honest, that I'm processing all the time. And I think creativity as a result is, again, one of those muscles that I still struggle to kind of put the nerve endings back together to figure out how to really like kickstart that. So that's a big theme of my journey into adulthood and out of the bubble of the Christian life.
I get that completely. And I started doing abstract art a while back. And for me, it's a very visceral experience. And it comes from here. It comes from the gut. And it's just this with the colors and and that sort of thing. I would not have felt free to do at all.
Yes.
It's like everything. I hate to use the term sanitized because it's more denatured. It's like the art, music, they were denatured. It's like if there's any living flavor, texture, soul, any living life force, authenticity, we got to scrub it because, God is apparently in this imaginary God is apparently so plain and so watered down and denatured and dead and easily offended that it's kind of ridiculous. It's like the same, like how can the same, by their own definition, how can the same divinity who created the butterflies and everything extraordinary, all the gorgeous, colorful fish, everything, this incredibly gorgeous planet that we live on, this incredible universe, how could it's like, does everything really have to be beige now?
Right.
Like, really?
Yes.
How can life force be offensive?
Right. I'm so happy that you said that, because I think that duality of like, I was constantly told that I had talent and that, I people expected me to be an artist, and I was sort of seen within the church circle to be like the creative person. But there was something really deep inside me that refused to do it in that way, because I knew it would kind of be a bastardization or not quite it would be a robotic. It would be like producing not for myself. And I didn't know how to do that. And so I kind of left it behind for a very, very long time. And I don't know if this is too personal, but if you getting personal,
this is for you.
Because we are getting personal, but it's interesting you said visceral, because so 4 years ago I had an abortion, and I've never told my mom. And if she finds out after this, then that's fine. But at the time, I just couldn't have that conversation with her, knowing how she brought me up and where she was coming from. And it was a choice to do that. It was a mutual decision between myself and the person I was with at the time. But afterwards I painted something, and I can show you later on, but it's red, black, kind of got these very harsh lines, like not this at all.
No, it's a different feeling. It's a different moment.
It's a different feeling. And I remember doing it. Essentially, it's almost like a, oh gosh, what's the
process?
There's like the spiral. I should know this because I learned it in like actual art. There's the spiral, and it like reduces in on itself, and it's like, it's a mathematical concept. But so it essentially, it breaks the canvas up like that, and
Fibonacci.
it's like, yes, thank you, Fibonacci spiral, and it's like diminishing. And I remember just feeling at the time, one, that like this literal removal of a thing from my body diminished me, but at the same time it didn't, and I felt so much anger because that was the lie I was taught. And so painting this thing was visceral. It was literally a visceral experience, of kind of processing that anger and the grief and everything at the time. And I think that really, it got me over that very, very difficult emotional hump for me, because of where I came from and where I'd grown up and how I'd grown up thinking about abortion and its place in anyone's life. And kind of got me through like the self-judgment, and got to a place of understanding and love on the other side of it. And so in that sense, when I do create things, or when I have engaged with art, it's out of these kind of very painful places. And it's hard for me to approach it in any other way, but I am grateful for it having been there for me at the time, because I needed it then. And I was really grateful that I was able to use that as a tool to help process how I felt.
Oh my gosh. Yes. There's so much power. And
yeah, the fact that you use the word visceral, I think is just like, that's blowing my mind right now, because that's literally like viscera, like, it's a medical term too. Like, and you did this to, down here. That's where
it comes from.
Where it came from. Yeah.
Like it really does. All the stuff I do, like especially painting, it's visceral. It's like, I want my hands dirty. Like, I want, I just want to get my body into it. And I was never able to do that until I had deconverted for a while, because it felt sinful and safe to actually be in my body and feel my body and enjoy it. It's a very feminine thing.
Yes.
Very feminine.
God. I could talk about this for hours. You've unlocked something here. But I know we have other things to talk about, but thank you for saying that, because that's very validating, and I appreciate that.
Well, tickled pink. So the naughty nine, media. What'd they say about media?
As in like news media?
Yeah. Dun, dun, dun.
We had all of our own. I mean, you see now there's like this widespread skepticism of news, of facts, of anything. And that's how I grew up. So again, not surprising. We had all of our own alternative sources of information, very much controlled by Focus on the Family. James Dobson had a lot of newsletters. National Right to Life was a newsletter we received very often, and it was literally about the Supreme Court when I was like 9. Like I knew things about that then. So when they were pushing for Supreme Court justices because of the pro-life bent, again, not surprising. So there's always kind of been this like alternate reality that Christians, at least in my experience, live in, make their decisions out of. And there's kind of a skepticism built into media as a news source, as an information source. But I think that connects to the skepticism of believing, of being in your body, trusting your body, trusting reality. There's kind of this mindset that I can't tell you how many times I heard in the world and not of it. And that extended to everything. It was like a mantra. You're in the world, but not of this world. You're getting ready for the next life. And that included information. And so, yeah, we were we didn't have a newspaper in our house. We only had Christian media, World Magazine, like a bunch of things that were only coming from those sources that, were coming from like a Christian perspective or a biblical perspective, or talked about things with that acknowledgement or that bent. And if it wasn't there, then it wasn't in our house.
Okay.
Yeah.
What did they say about family?
Focus on the family.
Need we say more?
Family is, it's ironic because the church, I think, was our family more than our actual family was. I would say that we spent more time and invested more energy into the relationships in the church structure, and the church being our support, the deacons, the kids I went to Sunday school with. We were all kind of in the same, neighborhoods and things growing up. And again, I didn't go to public school, so the kids that were at school for me were like, they were like friends, but they were more than that because we were brothers and sisters in Christ. So like there's that, there's the family element of all of the things that we did. We were all up in each other's business. Everyone knew each other's stuff going on.
Yes.
Boundaries really didn't exist. And I know that's funny that I connect that with family, but for me, that oversharing and people being kind of automatically assumed to be invited into whatever was happening in your life because there was an expectation that they would pray for you about it, or it was very messy, I would say, in the ways that families can be. But I didn't feel like there was a stop or like a sacredness to just the core group of my immediate biological family. I think that it was just very fluid between us and the church, and kind of how that interacted and how it influenced. Wow. My dad took a lot of advice from the people that he was mentored by, to the point again that those people were like spiritual parents to me. And so there wasn't much. Sorry, a phone call came in. I don't know if that interrupted. So those people were very much like spiritual parents to me. I had my own mentors, and I think to some degree there was a little bit of an abdication of parenting that happened because of that. I think they sort of outsourced it to the church, deferred to the church a lot of the times on things like discipline. I don't know, like we were spanked growing up. I don't know if that's something that my parents really wanted to do, or if that's just something they thought they should do. But again, that reflection and the idea of whether or not they wanted to do something in their own parenting style was so heavily influenced by the church itself that I don't think they even considered that they should deviate from that, I guess. So yeah, so it's very connected.
Good gracious. Okay. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I'm sorry to hear about the spanking.
Oh, thank you.
I thought, that's I certainly got it when I was a kid, but I'm in a different generation. Wow.
Well, yeah, the spanking was just another tool of control, really. They thought it was biblical. Again, the spare the rod, spoil the child verse. Again, like there were a lot of like quotes and things kind of being thrown around that kind of justified a lot of the things that we believed and did.
So interesting, because they were very isolated quotes, because you and I both know
Yes.
there are lots and lots of, there's an
Yes.
ocean of other quotes that
Yes.
could just as easily be cherry picked, but no, those don't count.
Yes.
But this one over here is very unique and serviceable. So this one we'll pay attention to.
Yes, and I think that had a lot to do with the influence of Dr. James Dobson. I think that he did that. I think he did a lot of, his own interpretations of what those scriptures meant in the context of parenting and family. And so much was just wholesale given to him in terms of his opinion, the books that he wrote, the magazines that he sent out, the specials we listened to on the radio. He's everywhere.
Money.
And then the other, really quick, the last piece of that is that because we were so far into this bubble, it isolated us from our extended family. So, my mom's side of the family don't have believers in the sense that she is. And so there's kind of always just been like an oddness to us as a family unit that I think made it really hard to connect with like cousins, or, we didn't have the same frames of reference. So our larger family, and that is a characteristic of a cult, right? That they kind of pull you away from your support systems and people who would kind of speak not like some other reality to you to make you doubt what's going on over here. Like, so we were not isolated 100%. We definitely had relationships, and my mom was a lot closer to her family and my dad was closer to their family. But as kids, I think me and my siblings, we were one more generation removed, and we didn't have as many ways to sort of connect back to them. And so I think that left us feeling a lot more isolated as a result.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to ask about religion and business, but I want to cut to the chase, unless you have something you're just like, oh, I got to say this. Okay. You said earlier that you were excommunicated.
Yes.
Now, you weren't planting bombs or doing anything horrible, were you?
No.
Didn't think so.
I think I did something worse in their eyes, though.
Have your own free will. Oh, wait a minute, I'm getting ahead of myself.
Yeah.
So, okay, would you be open to sharing a little detail about that? How does an innocent, law-abiding person get excommunicated?
So it was a process, and what's interesting is that the excommunication, in order to be excommunicated, you have to first be a member. So there was a process for that. And I think what's funny about it is that, churches have their own bylaws and things like that. So they make it seem very official. And like, there's kind of this process that it's like, well, you did violate this about the bylaws, and it's like, okay, well, so it's fair that I was excommunicated from the people that I grew up with and my mentors and everybody, because I did that.
Your whole life?
Yeah, my whole life. Everybody I knew up until that point, my whole life.
Brutal.
Which at the end was a blessing. It's fine. But
it's brutal.
But brutal. But to some degree, I think at that point it was a little bit my choice as well. Like, I kind of knew it was coming and I didn't do anything to stop it. But essentially what happened was I was a youth leader for a while and was very burnt out. I was working full time and then also doing like 40 hours a week kind of with the youth group. And reached a point where I felt like I was being spiritually abused, meaning kind of taken advantage of, and people using kind of spirituality to guilt me into certain things or make me feel like bad if I didn't give more. And it's like that 80-20 rule of like, 80% or 20% of the people are doing 80% of the work. Same thing, but worse in church, I think. And so I was just very burnt out and I was asking for help. I was asking for support. I wasn't receiving it. And then I ended up going away to school, to Christian college in Pennsylvania, and wasn't like attending and wasn't really participating in church as much while I was away. And then while I was at school, I also came out as bisexual, which at the time was an accurate label. I don't know if it's still accurate. I think I've since kind of expanded and gained greater understanding and things like that. But at the time I would call myself bisexual. And I just, as I moved further and further away from the framework of belief that my church held, I didn't want to go back and just kind of started to sort of sever those ties myself and needed space away to process and things like that. And so they hold a meeting, basically, is like when people have either stopped attending or have started to live kind of in violation of the tenets of what they believe. They hold a meeting of the members, and then they vote, and they decide whether or not to continue your membership. And they they voted not to continue my membership. And so at that point I knew I was welcome. So I just didn't go back.
You were voted off the island.
I was voted off the island. Yeah, the tribe has spoken.
You were voted off the
Jeff.
island.
Thanks, Jeff.
Oh my God. It wasn't a fun island and there were no rewards there.
No. It was maybe the best thing that ever happened to me, to be honest. And what's odd though is that it goes without saying that, there were a lot of people that I loved, and I know that a lot of people were even operating out of the best they knew how to do and all of that. But the truth that I learned is that the things that I believed only worked in the context of that bubble, and they prepared you very, very well to live in that bubble. But if you stepped outside of it, you realized how many skills and coping abilities and all of that you were really missing, and that you were woefully unprepared to kind of exist out in the world. And that was by design. So it very much, at that point, as I was stepping away, I was aware that I was stepping outside that bubble. But by that point, the curtain had been pulled back, and I knew I couldn't return to it. So it was what it was at that point.
Right. The ship had sailed. You'd had your moment.
The ship has sailed. Yes.
So in terms of recovery, what you've done some therapy, you've had resources, there's been help. What would you, if you were talking, like, there are going to be people listening who are thinking about getting out,
sure,
who haven't made the move because they're like, well, now what? I'm not equipped to, live out there. What resources, what would you say to them?
Well, the first thing I would say is that you're probably more equipped than you think you are. I also realized that, and as I was moving through it, that I had a bit more strength and a bit more tenacity and resilience than I thought that I did. But it didn't feel that way. But once I tried a couple of different things, or realized that I could get back up again. Like the first therapist I had, I didn't click with, and that was devastating. But then I found another one, and I realized, okay, it doesn't always happen immediately, and I can keep going, and it's fine. I think in the short term, like taking the time that you need, I needed to disconnect. And I needed to kind of just go into almost like low power mode. I looked for a new job because I was coming back from school, so I eventually needed to start working again. But the only goal I had for myself, I had two goals. One was to show up on time, and the other was to put mascara on, because I was like, you know what, I don't have the energy to do my hair every day. I don't have the energy to do a full face of makeup. I don't have the energy to kind of like be my quote unquote best self, or whatever that meant.
Right.
But
whatever
to me,
that means.
It was like that tiny little, like, if I can get up, I can put mascara on, I can show up to work on time. And then a lot of times once I got there, it was fine. Like something else took over, there was a little bit of like, okay, I'm in a different context now. There's people around me who can care about me. But it was like, I was upholding my end of the bargain for myself, just to just show up. To show up.
Yes.
That made all the difference. It was the showing up. Even if, I get very ahead of myself. I start to catastrophize. I start to turn things into right and wrong. And I have to remind myself that very little in this world is as black and white as the church makes it seem. And almost nothing.
I can't think of, there are very few things, okay?
Yeah.
Maybe at either side, way, way, way over the spectrum, but the rest, there's a whole lot of the rest.
Yeah. So I would say it's like, give yourself a chance to disconnect, set very, very small, manageable goals. And then like whatever that small goal is for yourself, like drink a glass of water in the morning. That's your goal for the day. Great. You did it. Yes. Show up for yourself, build trust with yourself by showing up for those little things. And start to listen to the little voice. Like, so that was the piece that probably took the longest for me. And I would say only maybe last year, late into last year, I'd say that I started to kind of really recognize what that voice was. I did a lot of therapy with different therapists, and kind of the inner child work was the thing that really kind of started to make a click for me. I don't know that I could have done that work much sooner though. I needed the journey of getting to that point to really make it impactful for myself. But you can still listen to your voice, or start to recognize that it exists, and to recognize that how quickly you sort of are trained to dismiss it.
Yes.
And just observe that process. Like, you don't even have to change anything, but just to observe that process, because then you start to get curious. Then you start to maybe want to listen to that voice a little bit, see what it has to say. And so giving it a chance to exist and to recognize what it sounds like is going to be the building block for pretty much everything else. So those are my pieces of advice.
I love that. I absolutely love that, because I absolutely agree with that and feel that in my bones. Like, everybody has it. Everybody has it.
100%. 100%. And I think that is the true kind of spiritual abuse that occurs in these cult-like contexts, is that they take that away from you. And that is the big piece that you're going to fight for, and that you're going to have to build back for yourself. Because from day one, at least in my experience growing up in this environment, you were taught not to trust yourself. You were taught that you were evil. You were taught that you're corrupted. You're taught that the things inside of you that you want are bad. And so just, it's going to be a long road of building trust back, but there's those beginning steps that once you recognize that, they're possible, that you can take them, that's the journey. So. And
what's on the other side? Like, this is handmade to heroin. So what's on the other side of it? Like, the vibrance, the life.
Yeah, just enjoyment in, it's like quiet. It's quiet. You don't feel guilty about everything. You don't feel, you feel free to be able to make choices based on what it is that you want. and that feels, even now, like when I say that, it almost feels like I can remember how I used to feel about how that was evil and how that was wrong and bad. And so just to be able to say that I can make the choice for me based on what I want, and that's not a bad thing. Nope. That's a huge, huge victory for me. And once you get a taste of that, everything just becomes sweeter. It's like no one's making you do it. You're doing it for yourself to make yourself happy. You recognize what happiness is. You can start to make choices that, you're happy with how you spent your day. You're happy with how you spent your week. You can quit your job because you don't like it and find a better one, which, that's an oversimplification, but those are down the line. But on the other side is freedom. And the irony is that they always say that God gives you freedom, Jesus gives you freedom, but only in the twisted sense that if you're thinking about in that context, so we were talking earlier about how it's almost the reverse. It's the gaslighting, right?
Yes.
So I have found that the truest things are the opposite of kind of what I was taught. So I start to question those things. So for me, I know that there are people that believe in Jesus and the Bible, and that they do it in a way that's enriching and that leads them to truths and a higher power and all of that. And I respect that so much, because I wasn't brought up that way. It can't be that for me.
Right.
And so for me, I was always taught that the way that I was brought up gave us freedom because we were free from sin. But the truth was that by denying self to the extent that we did, it created a bit of a prison, because we were so afraid of our own thoughts and feelings and emotions and wants and all of that. And that's no way to go through the world. So to me, on the other side, the freedom is acknowledging your thoughts and feelings and wants and realizing that it's not the end of the world. Like, that's
you are
amazing.
In fact a living, sentient, extraordinary, one of a kind, never before, 100%. Never to be repeated person. And that's pretty exciting and wonderful.
Yeah. And that's very blank slate. Like, that's a starting point. So like from there on, like whatever you want to do with that is your choice, but like you have the choice, and then you don't have to feel the suffocating shame and guilt that comes with it. And to me, that's actual freedom.
Yay. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Liz Dente, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.